The night did not end. It simply exhaled. The stars were still trembling, as if unsure whether to fade or to hold their place a little longer. The wind moved through the streets like a slow breath, returning to lungs that had forgotten the rhythm. And somewhere, between the last echo of sirens and the first whisper of dawn, the world remembered how to be silent again. No one could say when the noise had stopped. Maybe it wasn't sudden. Maybe the world had simply grown tired of shouting. The cities had burned themselves into exhaustion, and the voices of fear, pride, and power had finally run out of air. What remained was this, a silence so complete that even the ruins looked at peace. When the survivors woke, they did not scream. They opened their eyes carefully, like children afraid to wake a sleeping parent. The air felt heavy, but not dangerous, like rain about to fall. Someone stepped outside barefoot. The ground was cold and soft with ash, yet beneath it, there was the faint warmth of something alive. The sky was neither dark nor bright, just pale, like the inside of a seashell. No one had seen that color before. Time had stopped keeping count. The clocks had melted into stillness. The calendars had lost their courage. This was not the 7th day, nor the 1st. It was something else. It was the 8th day, the morning after the end of the world. There was no government, no headline, no broadcast to explain what had survived. Only breath, only bodies that remembered what it meant to be here. They did not rush to rebuild. They did not speak of what was lost. They walked. They touched walls, ran fingers along the skin of the world, as though afraid it might vanish if they did not. In the ruins of a marketplace, a woman found a loaf of bread. It was hard and half-burnt, but still bread. She placed it on the steps of a collapsed church. A man walked by and stopped. Without a word, she broke the bread in two and handed him half. He nodded, not out of thanks, but out of understanding. The simple act of sharing, that was the first prayer of the new world. The people didn't pray with words anymore. They prayed by breathing together, by lifting the fallen, by sitting side by side and watching the wind return to the trees. They didn't know who had survived or why. But for the first time, that question didn't matter. The old systems had ended in noise, machines that shouted, cities that forgot the sound of stillness. But now, the only law left was kindness. It spread quietly, like sunlight through dust. No command, no doctrine, just the small, instinctive tenderness of existence rediscovering itself. They began to gather near the rivers, though no one said why. Perhaps because water was still the only thing that moved freely. It sang, even now. The rivers had not judged humanity. They had simply waited. The people washed their hands, their faces, their memories. They watched their reflections, not as vanity, but as confession. The water did not accuse, it only shimmered. Someone started building a bridge, not of steel or stone, there was none left, but of wood and rope. The others joined in silence. It wasn't a bridge for crossing. There was nothing left to cross to. It was a bridge because humans are born to connect, even after they've forgotten what that means. The bridge was not practical. It was sacred. It was hope disguised as architecture. At night, they sat around the bridges, not to talk about the past, but to listen to the air. It carried distant sounds, the flutter of wings, the sigh of leaves. The earth was exhaling too, letting go of centuries of noise. In the middle of one city, there was a clock tower. Its hands had stopped at the same hour everywhere, the precise moment of the end. Yet now, its silence sounded like a heartbeat. The people did not fix it. They let it stay still, as a reminder that time had finally learned reverence. Children, those born of fire and fear, now drew suns on the pavement with pieces of chalk. But the suns they drew were white, not yellow. When asked why, one child said, "Because this light doesn't burn." In the 8th day, language changed. Words became gentler, smaller, fewer. People didn't say mine or yours anymore. They said ours. But even that word felt too loud. They learned to speak in gestures, a nod, a touch, a shared silence. It was as if they had remembered a language older than speech, the language of being. Some nights there were tears, not of grief, but of relief. People wept without knowing why, perhaps because survival felt heavier than loss. They looked at the stars, dim, trembling, half-broken, and realized those too were survivors. The universe had not ended. It had simply closed its eyes for a while. One old man said, "The world did not die. It only rested." He began to teach the children how to listen to wind. He said each gust carried stories, not from the past, but from the silence before the beginning. When they closed their eyes, they heard it. Laughter buried under centuries of fear, voices of ancestors speaking through breath. The wind became scripture, invisible and alive. In the 8th day, people rediscovered hunger, not for power or comfort, but for meaning. They began to rebuild gardens, not to conquer the land, but to feed it. Seeds were planted like prayers. Every sprout that rose through the ash was a sermon in green. Even weeds were allowed to grow. There was no hierarchy in the new world, only participation. A woman knelt in the garden one morning. The soil was dark and smelled like rain. She said softly, "The earth remembers us better than we remember her." A child beside her asked, "Will it forgive us?" She smiled. "It already has." There were no leaders, no prophets, only ordinary people doing sacred things, washing, planting, mending, holding. The sacred had returned to simplicity. Every gesture mattered. Every act of care was a form of resurrection. And yet, amid this quiet creation, there was still fear, a soft, leftover tremor from the world before. It visited them sometimes in dreams, sirens, smoke, screams. But even in nightmares, the people no longer ran. They faced the ruins and walked through them. Because now they knew that endings are not monsters. They are mirrors. As the days passed, no one knew whether they were counting forward or backward. It didn't matter. Time had become circular. Every sunrise felt like the first. Every nightfall like a closing chapter that promised to begin again. The people stopped naming days. There was no Monday, no Friday, no Sabbath. Only this, the 8th day, the day that existed outside the calendar, where creation continued. And slowly, miracles began to happen. Not loud ones, but quiet ones. A tree bloomed in the middle of a parking lot. Birds returned before anyone noticed. Two strangers who once hated each other shared a blanket in the cold. A child laughed in her sleep, and the whole world seemed to exhale with her. The air itself grew lighter, as if the earth had forgiven its own grief. The people began to hum, not songs they remembered, but melodies that felt ancient, older than the world, like music carried over from before time began. They hummed when they worked, when they prayed, when they walked. The humming spread, and soon the world sounded like a single, low heartbeat made of many voices. One evening, a young man climbed a hill that overlooked what was once a city. He looked down at the glowing remnants of firelight, at the bridge that now crossed a river reborn, and said quietly, "Maybe the end was never punishment. Maybe it was a cure." His voice did not echo. It simply dissolved into the wind, as if the world had heard and agreed. That night, rain fell for the first time since the end. It was gentle, slow, cleansing. The people stood in it, faces tilted upward, eyes closed. The rain carried the scent of beginnings. It washed the ash from hair, from roofs, from memory. And as it fell, someone whispered, "This is not water. This is mercy." When morning came again, no one called it a new day. It was still the 8th day, endless, unnumbered, quiet. The birds sang without fear, and the rivers glowed faintly under the sun's pale light. People walked barefoot, leaving tracks that the wind gently erased, as if to say, beginnings do not need proof. The world had ended, yes, but what replaced it was not death, only clarity. It was as if humanity had stepped out of a fever dream, blinking, disoriented, but alive. They did not ask to go back. They simply looked forward, though there was no horizon, only light. And somewhere, beneath the quiet hum of the 8th day, something vast stirred. Not a god of thunder, but a whisper of remembrance. It sounded like a sigh, or a promise, or the faint murmur of a universe saying, again. The rain did not stop. It learned to bless. It fell with the patience of old prayers, tracing lines down window glass that barely remembered being windows. Where it touched the ground, the ash softened, the soil opened, and seeds no one remembered planting, stirred like sleepers hearing their names. People gathered beneath the gentle weather, with faces upturned, letting mercy find the angles grief had sharpened. The rain smelled like bread cooling, like wood warmed by hands, like a memory you can finally hold without trembling. Gardens rose in places that had only known concrete. A parking lot forgot its lines and learned green again. Between two skeletons of buildings, beans climbed strings like children returning to a language they'd once spoken fluently. The world discovered that after does not mean less. It means tender. People crouched at the edge of their little squares of earth, as if listening for a heartbeat. They heard it. It was their own, joined to something larger. The pulse of a planet remembering it was not an empire, but a home. No one issued orders to plant. Hands simply reached for soil. Someone found a shovel and shared it. Someone else saved seeds from a withered tomato as if they were relics. A child tucked 3 kernels of corn into a coffee cup with holes poked in the bottom. He watered them with the earnestness of a vow. When the first shoot pushed up, a pale green, almost uncertain, every nearby face leaned in, smiling with the awe you saved from miracles you didn't dare plan for. The old words returned, not as slogans, but as gestures, breaking, mending, feeding. The bridges they'd built before the rain were now more than symbols. People carried harvest across them. A bowl of pears, a basket of potatoes, 6 eggs in a nest of cloth. Nobody bartered. They matched need to offering the way a song finds its harmony. On one bridge, someone chalked a sentence in letters that the drizzle could not quite erase. We do not own the morning. We belong to it. Passers-by touched the chalk dust and pressed it to their hearts like Ash Wednesday, like a promise to remain soft where power had once hardened them. Fear still visited, especially at night. It arrived politely now, without sirens, sitting at the foot of the bed, like an old dog uncertain whether it is welcome. People learned not to push it away. They named it. They fed it a little bread, then opened the door and let it walk the empty streets until it tired. By dawn, it always returned calmer, and when it lay down, it smelled faintly of rain. Children learned to sleep through fear's gentle watching, the way sailors sleep through known tides. The city's clock tower, the one that had refused to resume, began to serve another purpose. Its bells, once strict, now rang only when someone came home, not with hours, but with arrivals. You could be walking along the bridge and hear a single bright note, and everyone would glance up with the same quiet joy. Someone has returned. No one asked from where. Distance measured differently on the 8th day. The long journey might have been from anger back to trust. The bell did not care which. It had learned mercy's math. Names changed, too. People who had worn theirs like armor began to wear them like candles, small flames meant to be shared. A woman who had been manager gave her name simply as Anna, the way a hand gives warmth. A man once called Colonel became David, who liked to fix hinges and listen. Even the streets lost their numbers and took on the titles of ordinary miracles. Bread Lane, forgiveness. Walk, small river of laughing. Maps could not keep up. No one minded. When harvest turned abundant, they did not hoard. Abundance had not saved them before. They trusted a different law now. They let fruit fall and rot under trees, knowing rot is not waste, but translation. They saved seed without saving fear. They taught children to plant with a story on their lips, because story keeps time better than clocks. Once there was a world that thought it would end. Instead, it learned to begin. News, such as it was, traveled by footsteps, by benches, by shared cups. People spoke softly, as if sound itself had been wounded and needed care. If someone cried during a sentence, the sentence waited. If someone forgot what they were saying, they were not embarrassed. They were embraced. Memory had become a commons. No one lost alone. In that commons, grief lost its jaggedness. It was still heavy, but it no longer bruised on contact. It learned to ride in the passenger seat while hope drove. One afternoon, a girl climbed into the clock tower and found, behind the stopped hands, a nest of small bones and blue thread. Birds had been mending time with what they could find. She carried the nest down, cupped in her palms, and placed it in the church that wasn't a church anymore. The open place with bread on steps and vines through stone. People gathered. No sermon was preached. The nest rested on the altar of a sun-warmed bench. In the delicate architecture of bone and string, they saw a blueprint of the new world. Time rebuilt from tenderness, from what remains when the grand collapses. They began to hold a meal at dusk. No one led, so everyone did. A jar of olives shone like little green planets. Cheese wrapped in cloth. Soup, all was enough. Hands passed bowls, mouths blessed without words. Someone would begin a hymn, not because it was time to sing, but because the swallow of broth had loosened a song in their throat. The melody was not complicated. It was the low hum of gladly being alive. If you have ever heard bees in lavender, you know the sound. Between bites, people remembered, carefully, like lifting old glass. They did not list horrors. They named the few mercies they had salvaged from the weight. A stranger's coat, a lit window, a wrong turn that turned out to be salvation. They placed those mercies on the table like salt. Every story ended with the same sentence: I am here. Everyone would answer, we're here. And though the grammar wasn't pretty, it was accurate. It tasted like bread. On the ridge beyond the bridges, the first orchard took root. Peaches, a leaderless decision. The pits lined up in their shallow beds looked like commas in a letter to the future. People watered them, sang to them, introduced them to the wind. This is your neighbor, they'd say, patting the next sapling soil. Be kind. A year later, fat fruit hung low enough for small hands to pick. The juice ran down wrists, turned elbows into altars. No ladder was reserved. None was withheld. They learned that abundance is an instrument. It plays best in many hands. When winter came, it was a smaller winter than they remembered. Snow knew not to smother the greens entirely. Ice stepped lightly. Fires were coaxed, rather than sparked. People slept early and woke before sun, surprised to find that darkness has flavors, not only fear, but cinnamon, cedar, warm wool. In the long nights, they exchanged the stories of what had kept them kind when the world had not encouraged kindness. Some had a person's name, some had a dog's, some had a book that had walked with them like a friend. Most had a memory of water. On the night the first child was born after the end, the bells didn't ring. The air itself rang, softer than metal, brighter than breath. The baby's cry was not new to the universe, and yet every ear around the hearth opened as if hearing a fresh word written where words come from. No one argued about the naming. The name arrived like weather. They called the child Morn. It meant nothing and everything. Later, many children would receive names like that: Bridge, Olive, Quiet, Return, and none would feel strange in their mouths. They had not planned a ceremony for naming the 8th day. It seemed the sort of thing one would ruin by rushing. But the day came anyway, by accumulation. It arrived the morning someone placed a loaf on the bridge, not because they had spare bread, but because they wanted whoever crossed to meet hospitality by surprise. It arrived when a woman, seeing a boy steal an apple, placed 2 in his pocket and kissed his hair. It arrived when the clock tower grew ivy that reached the stopped hands and covered them, not to hide but to heal. If you asked the people when the 8th day was named, they would point to too many small tendernesses to fit on a single calendar box. And so, without proclamation, language followed. They called the 8th day by an old word that had worn new shoes: Sabbath. Not a rule, but a rest that had learned to walk. Sabbath meant the bridge would hold. It meant the loaf would wait. It meant if you came to the river with only the thirst, you were not empty. You were prepared. Work happened still, hard and honest, but it bowed to enough. More had retired. By then, maps had become stories. Stories had become invitations. The city's borders dissolved into hospitality. Travelers arrived not looking for shelter, but for belonging. And belonging is the kind of shelter that does not leak. Every guest learned the customs quickly. Look people in the eye. Take the smaller portion. Leave something mended behind. The sign at the edge of town was a hand-painted plank. Welcome home, even if you are just passing through. The parenthesis mattered. Mercy loves parentheses. They cradle the exceptions. Sometimes the sky lowered like a cathedral ceiling, and rain pattered on tin roofs like liturgy. Other times, the horizon drew razor clear, and people saw mountains they hadn't known were there. Children were taught the constellations anew: the loaf, the bridge, the orchard, the lantern. There was a story for each, a parable without the scolding, a hope you could nap beneath. A woman once asked at the dusk meal, "What did we lose that we must never try to get back?" No one answered right away. There was no rush to fill the good silence. Finally, a boy, his mouth bright with peach, said, "Winning." The table nodded, adults the most vigorously. The word laid itself down between ladles and spoons, like a tool retired with honor. What replaced it did not need a name. It manifested as sleeves rolled, as chairs added, as time given. As the years of the 8th day unwound and rewound, for time now moved like thread through fabric, not like teeth on gears. The world learned to bless what it had once merely used: light, water, hands, pauses. There were fewer speeches and more benches, fewer plans and more gardens, fewer borders and more thresholds. The difference being that thresholds never tempted you to point a weapon, they invited you to set one down. Weapons didn't exactly disappear. They went out the way a storm does, muttering spent. A blacksmith hung a rifle above his forge where his father's father had once hung the first plow. He left it there to grow dust golden and irrelevant. People began to travel to the sea again, not to conquer it, but to ask forgiveness for the time they had tried. The ocean answered the way oceans answer, by breathing in and out, leaving gifts at their feet. Smooth glass, driftwood, a note in a bottle from a child upriver that read simply, "Do you need anything?" They wrote back with drawings of peaches and bridges and a clock covered in green. The bottle returned 3 weeks later with a single word, "Yes." When they opened it, an olive pit fell out. If you stood on the highest ridge at dawn, you could hear the comfortable secrets of a healed place. Goats complaining amiably, water talking over stones, a laugh that started in one house and finished in another, because walls had learned to share. You could look down at the small, ongoing festival of survival, the unchoreographed dance of a street where bread passes hands and no one counts. You could close your eyes and know the place without seeing it, because knowing had become a sense again, not just a calculation. And if you kept vigil there long enough, you would witness the most ordinary miracle of the 8th day. The way the sun arrives, as if it were shy to interrupt such kindness, peeking, blushing, then committing, and the way faces lift to it not as worship, but as welcome. For the sun, too, had been tired of shining on cruelty. It was happy to have this work. On the morning that felt, to everyone at once, like a conclusion and a beginning, the bells finally rang on purpose. Not to mark a schedule, but to admit a truth. We remember how to begin. People came from gardens, from rivers, from bridges that needed no maintenance, but received it anyway, because care is the point. They gathered near the clock tower softened by ivy, and the oldest among them spoke, not loudly, not long. "We will keep this day without counting it. We will keep it by keeping one another." Then they did a new old thing. They washed one another's hands with water perfumed by mint and lemon peel. They pressed their wet palms together and felt the cool of mercy pass back and forth. Someone started that low hum again. This time, the melody had learned steps. It moved through the crowd with confidence. Babies squealed. The shy smiled in public. The grieving rested their foreheads on shoulders, not their own, and felt no need to apologize. The bells did not interrupt. They harmonized. After the meal that followed, because there is always a meal that follows, people did not disperse so much as flow back into their days. A child fell asleep on the bridge, a crust of bread still in his hand, like a handle on a dream. Someone covered him with a coat that had once been a uniform. The coat was warm with the body it had known. It would be warm again. Nothing good retires on the 8th day. It changes job descriptions. And in the last light, just before the hour when night's gentleness meets day's endurance, a woman stood alone on the ridge. She had a piece of chalk left in her pocket from her child's games. On a flat rock, she wrote, "We did not survive to be the same." The chalk snapped at the final letter, as if endorsing her point. She placed the half beside the sentence for the next hand to continue. Then she turned toward the valley, where lamps were being lit the way stars are lit, unsupervised, in agreement. And she walked home through a world that had remembered how. The 8th day did not need a benediction. It was one. But if a blessing could be spoken over a blessing, it would sound like the hush that follows laughter, like the footfall of someone you love returning, like the simplest sentence, finally telling the truth. Begin again.